consciousness is a network of information that exists in a rolling state of self-resolution. It's not a state, it's a motion towards that state, towards a minimum of energy that is never reached, because there's always infusions of new information, new experiences, and that then causes a further round of rethinking and abstracting and reevaluating and trying to find the minimum of energy in that model. And that rolling towards the minimum of energy that never stops, that's what I call consciousness. Does that exist inside of a single cell?
Dr. Nikolay Kukushkin is a neuroscientist and biochemist at NYU, and the award-winning author of One Hand Clapping, a sweeping origin story of the human mind. His research spans from dysfunctional proteins in Alzheimer's to a headline-grabbing discovery: memory-like learning in non-neural cells, showing that even kidney and liver cells can learn patterns, rewriting what we thought we meant by memory. He argues consciousness isn't a thing in your head, but a rolling network of information, forever settling and resettling. And you are that information, not just your physical body. Subscribe before your cells forget, and because your mitochondria really deserve the most premium brain content on the internet.
What we really have to start with is the distinction between information and matter. That is something that's built into life from the very beginning. We think of DNA, RNA as molecules, but they're primarily, the most important part of them is that they're pieces of information. And it's those pieces of information that are actually alive. There is no atoms that are the same between my DNA and my grandfather's DNA. They're made of totally different atoms coming from different sources. What is inherited, what is preserved, what exists, what continues existing is information. Then eventually, by folding that information like an origami sheet, by making it more complicated, by embedding it into different parts of your body, by sort of wrapping it in the circuits of the brain, you eventually see how that information gradually matures into your consciousness. And then you don't have that puzzle for where in my body is this consciousness? Is it here? Is it there? Well, it's not in your body, because you are not your body. You are this piece of information that inhabits your body. Once you see it that way, I think it's a lot easier to connect yourself to the material world and not see a contradiction between being special, being wonderful, being magical, being miraculous, and consisting of atoms and molecules. Because atoms and molecules were never just atoms and molecules. They were always essences, ideas, superpowers, properties, and out of those things that's what builds up everything else.
Nikolay Kukushkin. I hope I pronounced that right.
That's right. Yes, thank you.
What
You can call
is
me
the
Nico.
best way for someone to really understand cellular memory?
Well, I think the best way to understand cellular memory is first to think about what we really mean by normal memory, by that word, memory. And then think about what actually happens when that process occurs. So usually when we refer to memory, it's what happens when I close my eyes and what pictures I see in my mind, that subjective memory, that introspective memory. But really, that's not what neuroscience studies at all. No neuroscientist studies this. It's impossible to study. What you can study is things like animal behavior, how a mouse moves in an arena. Did it freeze? How many times did it freeze? For how long did it freeze? After you did something to it. And from there, okay, that mouse must be thinking to itself, must be remembering, like I remember, like I usually close my eyes and remember. And then from that projection, you think, okay, that change in the behavior of the mouse, that is like my memory. But really, what is happening in that mouse brain and what is happening in the human brain is neurons changing in response to an experience. And what does a neuron know about this experience? To any individual neuron, and there are trillions of them in the brain, to any individual neuron, all that experience is chemicals, pulses of neurotransmitters arriving from different sides, from different inputs, different locations at different times. That's all it knows. That's all that it has, time and chemicals. And from there, each neuron extracts a pattern, figures out which of these signals, which of these chemicals are important and which are not, which ones it should discount and which ones it should incorporate, which ones it should respond to, turn on genes, restructure its cellular surface, change its connections to other cells. But that kind of thing that this neuron is doing, every cell is doing that. Every cell receives chemicals. It's not neurotransmitters necessarily. It could be hormones, nutrients, salts, liquids. Depending on where that cell is in the body, its pattern of experiences would be different. But each cell has that same pattern of experiences as a neuron does. Not the same one, its own one, but also a pattern of experiences. And it also needs to take in those experiences, filter out the ones that are unimportant, take the ones that are important, and change something in those cells in the process. So what our research shows is that cells in the brain doing that is the same process as cells in the rest of the body doing it. It relies on the same molecules, it works in the same way, it registers same basic patterns of experience, and it probably evolutionarily is derived from the same source. It was there before there were brains, before there were kidneys, before there were animals or organs. It's there from way before that, from the time when there were only cells swimming in the ocean. And they too had to register patterns of experience and change themselves in the process. So it's a very old process.
Really cool. Well explained. Do you think that there's any fundamental difference between memory on a human level and memory on a cellular level? Is there any difference, or is it just a matter of the type of information that's being encoded and the scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we need to think about here is emergence. It's sort of like asking, is there a difference between a gene and carbons and phosphorus and nitrogen atoms that form the DNA? Well, no, it's the same thing, but it's a different way of looking at that thing. You know, when you combine those chemical atoms in the particular configuration, they become something else. They become this DNA molecule that carries inheritance. That is a lot more than just those pile of those atoms. So I think the same is true for the relationship between cellular memory and human memory. Of course, our human memory is very complex. It consists of billions of individual memories of individual neurons. And when they arrange their individual memories in a very specific configuration, when the right neurons in the right place remember the right cellular things, that's when our human psychological memory arises. So is it different? Well, no, there's nothing else. It consists of the same thing, but it is emergent upon them. It is something else in the sense of when you combine them together, it acquires properties that you don't find in those individual cells.
Right. It's been a bit of a hot topic on the podcast since I spoke to Dr. Michael Levin. He will
yes,
really
we both love emergence.
Yes, but he will really expand how you think about biological systems, right? Words that we thought used to be exclusive for humans, like intelligence or problem solving or having goals. He's really convinced me, alongside other people, have really convinced me that cells are doing something similar. Now, not everyone is on that train. I've also spoke to people who think that that's muddying the science. You can't just take the same word and bring it across to cells. I'm curious if you think there's what would you say to that critic that says, no, memory is a human thing. What cells are doing is something else. It's impressive, it's complex, it's cool, it's marvelous science, but it's something different. What would you say to that?
What I always ask in this question is to define what you think your memory is. Exactly. Define it from first principles, from fundamentals. I think that what trips us up is the different sides from which we reach into this concept. Some people reach into this, what is memory, from myself, from my own subjective point of view. You start there, and then from there, you try to say, well, this memory might be stored in these cells or these molecules. How does that work? Where does this thing that I've already defined psychologically, where does it live? And the other approach is to start with the small things, with the molecules and cells, and say, like, what can we call a memory once they come together? What arrangement can they take that would qualify as memory? if we define it from first principles. So you start either from the bottom up and you try to build up this memory from basic components, or you start from the top down and you try to find your senses, your subjective point of view in those components and the molecules. And I am more of a second person. I'm a molecular biologist by training. I started with cells and molecules, and then I became interested, how do they become arranged into a mind? So for me, this progression is more natural. I always think in fundamentals, first principles. And I think that it is difficult for a person who starts with a psychological view to define memory in abstract terms. Yes, you can define it for a human. Yes, you can project that onto a mouse. But what happens when you go beyond the mouse? What happens when you go to a sea slug? That's something that I worked on in Tom Caru's lab for many years. When you work on a sea slug, you really start to question these things because, well, in a mouse, when a mouse freezes in an arena, you can easily imagine it's a very similar animal. You can put yourself in the position of that animal and imagine what you would be remembering in that moment. That's why we call it memory. But you can't do that with a sea slug. A sea slug doesn't have any parts in the brain where you could project your parts of the brain.
Yes.
Its experience is completely different. It doesn't see the world physically like we do. It doesn't receive this kind of visual information. It doesn't receive those sounds that we have. It doesn't remember whole episodes like we do. You can't project yourself on this animal. So, well, does that mean that it doesn't have memory then? We just not use this concept for anything that is not ourselves or some very similar creature? I think that is a strange way to define it. If only we have memory, well, to me that is an incomplete concept. And I think that people who start with the psychology, they just ignore the fact that, well, the majority of creatures on this planet are not like us, and they still have to remember.
It makes a lot more sense to go bottom up from an evolutionary perspective, right? I mean, all of these things, it's a bit preposterous to say that intelligence, consciousness, memory emerged at the level of humans, and it didn't exist for the billion years of successful life that was occupying niches and evolving. The bottom up just makes a lot more sense from there. I agree with everything you're saying, and I think it's such a beautiful way of looking at biology as well, as this non-deterministic, agential, sort of incredibly complex but beautiful system where all these cells are somehow working together to produce, trillions of cells somehow working together to produce one unified whole. Let's dive into the research that you've done that's shown the evidence for memory in non-neural cells, because I was really interested to hear this. When I did my neuroscience degree, I didn't hear any of this work. So it's an exciting paradigm shift.
Yeah, I agree. We are very excited about this work because of the same reason as what you just referred to, because it erases this boundary between the mind and the body. It says that, when you boil it down to first principles, everything works in the same way. Your brain is doing the same things as your body cells are doing for its own purposes, for its own body things, not for your brain things. Your kidneys don't remember how to ride a bicycle. Your brain does that. But the kidneys remember kidney things. They have their own things to remember, and they do that in a very similar way. So that's the bottom line of our research. We wanted to ask if non-neural cells have the capacity to distinguish between patterns of experience.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work.
BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
Just like I said, every cell has its own experience. Depending on what kind of cell it is, it receives its own chemicals at its own times. And so what we focused on is this psychological effect of memory and learning that has been known for 200 years. It's called the mass-spaced effect, or the spacing effect. And what it refers to is this idea that given the same amount of training or learning, if you do it in one go, if you cram it all in one go, you will form a worse memory than if you space it with periods of rest.
Cramming for a test versus,
so for example, cramming for a test versus just studying, consistently over a course of a few days. Of course, you will remember things better if you do it over a few days. So this has been known for a long time, and the first person to establish this was this German. Well, he wouldn't have called himself the neuroscientist at that time, but we would call him that today. He did experiments on himself, which was really fascinating. He turned his whole life into this memory experiment where he would memorize random nonsense words, these 3-letter nonsense words, and he would read them to himself at very specific times, the specific number of times, and then he would test when he would recall how many words, and he would draw these graphs of recall. It was a really, really involved experiment that he was doing on himself, but he was the first person to really formalize these things about memory that we maybe understood intuitively in the past, but he was the first one to really turn them into something measurable. So that's where the spacing effect sort of first comes into science. But what I think is interesting about this is that it's something that we know about memory intuitively, but it used to be thought as this psychological thing. Go back to 100 years ago, people would have said it's a property of the soul that we remember things this way.
Yeah.
And what our study shows is that this very property that we used to think was a property of the brain, of our mind, is actually a property of every cell, including even kidney cells. They also have this mass-spaced effect. How do we know this? We've created artificial experiences for these cells. We've used chemicals that emulate signals from other cells. We use 2 different chemicals that sort of create these artificial signals that they could have been receiving from their neighbors, for example. And we give them at different times. We wash them into this petri dish at different times. We wash them out for a few minutes. We give them a few minutes of rest. We do different patterns of exposure to these chemicals. And what we measure then, what those cells do for us, is we leave them alone after this treatment, this exposure. We usually leave them for 24 hours. They just sit there, rest. And then we've engineered them to produce this glowing protein that tells us that their memory genes have been activated. We know there are memory genes because we know what genes are activated in neurons, in brain cells when we learn. That's fairly well established. We kind of know the basic profile of what genes neurons turn on when you learn. So we look for those same genes. We've engineered these kidney cells to create this reporter protein. We call it a reporter because it glows. It tells us that this gene has been turned on. But what this gene is the same gene as what neurons use. So we artificially created the cell in such a way that it would report to us when it has created a memory. And what we give it is these different patterns of chemicals. And what we found was that the same chemicals, given them for 12 minutes in one go, produces a worse memory, less of that glowing protein, than if you have 4 pulses of 3 minutes spaced by 10 minutes. So what I'm talking about here is minute scale differences, minutes. And then the response is this memory, the cellular memory, 24 hours later. That's what the real surprise here is. We don't usually think of non-brain cells as operating on these kinds of timescales. Neurons, yes. Neurons, they can distinguish very fast patterns. They receive their neurotransmitters at millisecond time intervals. They can tell very specific times. Yes, we give them that. We know that neurons are very fast cells. But generally, people think of non-brain cells as operating on the scale of hours, days, maybe. But what we show is that actually, those cells that we think of as slow, they can tell differences between minute scale time patterns. Again, the amount of training that they receive, the amount of exposure is the same. The only difference is those 10 minutes of spacing. And they can detect that, and that reflects on their expression of memory genes 24 hours later. We also tested a few mechanics of the process. We know how it works in a neuron on a basic level, so we can probe multiple parts of that process, and we can ask, does it work the same way in a kidney cell? Does this part work the same way? Does this part work the same way? And whatever we probe, it does work in the exact same way. They use the same tools, the same cogs, the same basic cell biology to enact this pattern discrimination that is stored in their cellular state. So that is in common between neurons and other cells. Of course, neurons are more complicated. It's not that we're saying that neurons are stupid and they're just another cell. No, they have their own special abilities. But this part, the storage of pattern in cellular state, this part is something that all cells do for themselves.
Really cool, and really cool work, and very well explained. It's not clear to me where this information is encoded in the cell, because with neurons, we know that they encode information by strengthening and weakening synaptic connections, the actual morphological change of the synapse to allow more neurotransmitters to cross. So we can we've mapped that quite well. We can see, and it's quite simple to understand how strengthening synapses, weakening synapses can encode information in a reliable way. When a cell takes on a memory and encodes it, is it distributed all over the cell? Is there, I'm guessing there isn't a memory base for it, otherwise you probably would have found that by now. But how is that information encoded within the cell?
Let's first think about the example that you gave about neurons. That neurons store their memory in synaptic contact. Okay, what does that mean if we zoom in a little bit more? What that means that a synapse is two neurons. There's really two endings of two neurons. So they're both changing something. There's two neurons changing something in their state. Let's focus on this one. This one, let's say it receives neurotransmitter. So what it can do, it can increase the number of antennas of those receptors that receive the neurotransmitter. That is what makes that synapse stronger. So physically speaking, this strengthening of the synapse is more receptors on the surface of this receiving cell. Now, those receptors, they don't just sit there and do nothing. They're constantly circulating. They're moving in and out and in and out. It's not like you distribute them there and then they stay there and then nothing happens and then they move out of there. It's an equilibrium. They circulate. And sometimes when a cell has received some pattern of neurotransmitters, it pushes more of them onto the membrane. So the equilibrium shifts towards more of those receptors on the membrane. Now, to maintain that push, to maintain that extra amount of receptors on the membrane, the cell has to modify something else within itself. It has to be maintaining, maybe some signaling kinase that would be phosphorylating that enzyme. And why would that signaling kinase be maintained? Well, there needs to be maybe some gene that is turned on that constantly keeps this protein going at a higher than usual amount. And so you say that it's stored in the strengthening of the synapse, but underneath that there are further changes, further mechanisms, further cellular memory, and it doesn't necessarily stay in one place. You could have your histones modified, the packaging of DNA is modified inside the nucleus. That means that some genes are constantly turned up. You could have some feedback loops inside of the cell. Some kinase turning on another one, and that one turns on the first one, and they sort of exist in this feedback loop, maintaining each other's activation. You could have some molecule that is secreted from the cell and then signals back on itself, and that's how it maintains some activated state. But there needs to be something preserved within the cell that holds it in this new state. And that is how it's stored. And that is also how our cellular memory would be stored. We don't think it's stored in one place. We already know many different points of cell biology that are distinct in the cell. And we think that no individual one of them is that thing that if you remove it, everything falls apart. No, they're all reaching this new stable equilibrium where all of these processes feed back on themselves just so it now stays in this new balance. It stayed in one homeostatic balance before, and now you've shifted it to some new state, and all of the processes and no single one is holding that in that state. Maybe I'm wrong about that. It's possible that we will eventually find some one switch. If you inactivate it, all the other parts of this disappear, and that's what holds that memory. It's possible, but I don't think so. I think each individual node there is important and not exclusively important. Nature just doesn't like such individual switches that are easy to break. It likes redundancy. It likes to distribute a state within many, many different nodes.
Very cool. The way you describe this of cellular memory of a cell changing its internal state and then adapting its behavior to a future stimulus or something else, does that also sound a bit like an emotion? Do you understand what I mean? This sort of persisted through time change in state or physiology, which changes how you react to a different stimulus down the line. Is there a way that you could tease that apart in cells, do you think? Because it sounds very similar, or maybe I have that wrong. You can point out.
No, I think it's a great question, and again, we're coming to the same issue of language and how you define words. You could define them from your emotion. An emotion of a cell is something like my emotion, and then you would be looking at what inside of that cell looks like this thing that I'm experiencing from within. Or you could try to define what is emotion from first principles. That's a little bit harder than defining memory from first principles. I don't know what's a good definition of emotion from sort of basic philosophical terms. But how we understand emotion now is that it's this complex, multidimensional state of a brain, of a neural network that is based, from at least what I understand, it's really kind of out of my wheelhouse, but from what I understand, it is largely based on body states. Like an emotion is this complex abstraction of a state of a body. It's derived from our sensing of internal organs and pain and just awareness of the body, and then abstracting that into something really highly dimensional. That's where you get an emotion. That's how I think about it. So then we can define it as a highly abstract representation of a body state. Let's put it that way. Does a cell have a highly abstract representation of a body state? I bet it does. Somewhere in its genome, some central regulator of multiple multiple genetic programs that's hierarchically sitting on top of many genetic networks. Why not call that an abstraction of the cell's body state? Yes, if we define it like this, then we can say that that's all that emotions are. We can use it without quotation marks if we just define it in this bottom-up way. But I think a lot of people will be very uncomfortable with that.
But
even more so than with memory.
But if you open the floodgates and you start saying things like intelligence are not limited to humans or animals in general, the organisms, it seems arbitrary to then start cutting off like no emotions is an organism thing. It might be that in the decade to come, we functionally tease it apart and say a cell does have memory and a cell does have an emotion, and they should exist on the same continuums as human emotion and human memory and they do specific things, and maybe there's actually a difference in the state change through time, in the way the memory, in the information is encoded. That would be really interesting. I have no idea. Do you know anyone working on the cellular emotion space? Is that a thing?
I've never heard of this before this conversation, but now I'm thinking that maybe they should. I think what you're saying here is, I agree with that. I think that that's ultimately where neuroscience has to move. But what we're talking about here is not simply learning something new about kidney cells. We're talking about redefining the entire language of psychology.
Yes.
The psychology that has historically been grounded in how we think about ourselves without any scientific knowledge. We close our eyes and we come up with these categories for different mental phenomena. And then historically it's been that we then take those words and then we search for them in circuits and neurons and brain waves, and then when we can't find them, we think that there's a mystery. But what you're suggesting here is that we need to redefine all of that completely, remove those lay terms that we're so used to, and instead define them from math, from logic, from these basic interactions between nodes of information. I agree. I think that is the long-term goal of neuroscience, to construct this new language that would be bottom up rather than top down. But
Right.
it will take some real paradigm shifts, not just in science, but in how we think about ourselves.
Right. I can't remember who said it to me, but I think it was someone on the podcast said a bunch of smart Greek people like thousands of years ago came up with these words, and we've just been trying to match phenomena to them for the rest of
That's
science.
exactly right. That's exactly right. There's one particular example that I really like. It comes from this paper by Yuri Bozaki, a very distinguished professor here at NYU, who thinks about these same questions of how you define mental phenomena. And one example that he used in his paper was this theta rhythm. There's this particular rhythm that you can detect between the hippocampus and the cortex. There's this signal that oscillates at a particular frequency there when the animal does something. And so historically there have been these, I think he lists something like 40 different interpretations of what this theta rhythm does. Oh,
Right.
it's a memorization rhythm. Oh, it's an attention rhythm. It's a head turning rhythm. It's a head direction rhythm. It's an alertness rhythm. But what it really is the theta rhythm. We should be defining all those other things through it. Those should be unified through this common grounding in the theta rhythm, rather than trying to
Yes.
define it through those lay words that we, like you said, Greek scholars have come up with a few thousand years ago. So yes, I
Absolutely.
think in the long run, that's how we should be thinking. But it's very hard to imagine us shifting our everyday conversations to discussing how does your theta rhythm feel today, or what's your
Right.
dopamine levels, instead of saying how are you happy, or how's your day, things like
Asking
that.
someone about their gene regulatory networks or something
Exactly.
overclappy.
What's your serotonergic tone today?
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. What do you think are the biggest implications of this shift in biology, to go from this sort of somewhat deterministic world of biology to this much more messier, murkier, but you know, everything is agents. They have goals. They might be conscious. We'll get to that later. But what do you think are the biggest implications of this for biology, for medicine, for anything else?
Well, I think we can look at it both ways, right? So we're showing that there is this continuity between the brain and the body, between the mind and the body, even. So you can take it both ways. You can think about approaching the mind more like we approach our body. I think that we think a lot about the hygiene, about healthy food, about maintaining our body in this healthy state. It's not always been like that. People didn't always think in those terms. But as a civilization, we're getting to this point when we care about our body, and we understand that it's something that you need to maintain and take care of. But we don't necessarily think this way about the brain. We don't think that that by absorbing useless memories and then spitting them out, and then absorbing more useless memories, that you are somehow wearing out your brain, that something would be wrong with it, that maybe you're oversaturating yourself with information, that maybe that will somehow impact your emotional state or what you can remember in the future. We don't have a concept of mental hygiene yet, and I think we're coming to that point when it's important. We recognize that our current interaction with information, with experience, is too much. It's not making us happy. It's not sustainable. And so I think that as we learn that the brain is like any other organ, in a sense, that it operates using same principles, I think maybe we can approach this with the same kind of hygiene that we approach the rest of our body. But also, on the other hand, we can think about the body more like we think about the brain. So what I mean is, anything that we do on a schedule, anything that is timed, food, medicine, exercise, all of that can have an effect on any part of your body, not just depending on what it is, but depending on the precise timing, and even down to the minutes. That could have effects on your body that could last hours, days, weeks, maybe even longer. What exact patterns of food are good for you and are bad for you? What exact patterns of consuming water and nutrients and liquids? I don't know yet. All that we can say is that patterns matter. And so it's it's not a crazy thing to try to optimize that, to find the pattern that works for you. It's not, you're not imagining it if you think that a particular routine in a particular way makes you feel better. It's very possible that that's built into the structure of the very cells of your body. So I think that is the part that we understand about the brain, that if you want to remember something, for example, you have to repeat it a few times. You have to do it at a certain point. You can't be too tired when you're doing that. You can't be sleepy. And maybe that is also something that we could bring into our relationship with our body, approaching it more as a brain that exists in time and whose experience is laid out as this pattern of events as well.
Interesting. Not the answer I expected, but a cool one. Could you see a future where we have like a wearable and it's kind of pinging us, it's reading some digital signature across, I don't know, the bioelectric fields of all of the cells or something. It's extrapolating the information somehow, and it's saying that it's optimal for you to drink your water at 1 p.m., 4 p.m., 7 p.m., whatever. It's optimal to go to sleep.
It's not, because can you imagine how much anxiety that would cause if you could control every part of your food? We are already too anxious about controlling our lives. If we had every cell of our body reporting its state and telling us to optimize the pattern of its experience, I think we would go completely crazy. But yes, jokes aside, I do think that that's possible, wearable or diagnostics. But yes, I think we will take into account not just cells as building blocks, but as individuals with their own experiences. And we have to take those experiences and the past history of our body, the past history of each cell, into account when we think about health and disease as well.
Do you think a cell is conscious?
Well,
the way you
what
say
is consciousness?
It sounds a lot like it. You said individuals with experience, right? Like that, just for me, that screams like that's my definition of consciousness. How do you think about this?
I think a consciousness is, out of all these terms that we discussed, memory, emotion, that we usually start from ourselves and then take down, and I try to move the other way around. I think consciousness is the hardest of them all, because that's the purest expression of what we name because of what we see from the inside. That is what we see from the inside. And so it's very difficult to define it in a way that would start from first principles, because that already automatically means that you've taken it outside of yourself and define it through something else. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that in the first place. But to me, consciousness is a network of information that exists in a rolling state of self-resolution. It's not a state. It's a motion towards that state, towards a minimum of energy that is never reached. because there's always infusions of new information, new experiences, and that then causes a further round of rethinking and abstracting and reevaluating and trying to find the minimum of energy in that model. And that rolling towards the minimum of energy that never stops, that's what I call consciousness. Does that exist inside of a single cell? Maybe. Not necessarily.
Interesting.
I don't know if molecular networks of proteins and genes would fit that definition. I think there's something fundamentally different about those networks and neural networks, and the difference is that each protein has to adapt to its target. There's no modularity in a way that exists in the brain. You can hook up any neuron to any other neuron, and not exactly, but in the grand scheme of things. But a protein, you can't just plug in one protein to the next and then to the next and to the next. It's much harder to build an infinite network with an infinite number of layers, whereas neurons, you can just build layers upon layers upon layers upon layers without inventing really anything categorically new. So I think neurons are a lot better adapted to create this large-scale network that would have information rolling through it in this way that we call consciousness. But I think it's theoretically possible that something that falls under this definition would be implemented through not neurons, through something else. And maybe that would be molecules inside a cell.
I love the analogy of it rolling downhill, maintaining its life with its own goals. The way I think of it is subjectivity is at the core. You know, I've spoken to Peter Godfrey Smith and Anil Seth, and what I've really gotten from them, I think, is that something is conscious if there's an experience of what it is like to be that thing.
Yeah.
And what you're describing, where the cell is able to receive something from its environment, adapt its internal state in some way that modulates its goal, its behavior, integrate that outside information with its internal information, that seems like subjectivity. Like that is subjective on that cell by almost definition. Like that fits at least my minimal definition of conscious. I was speaking to William Miller, who's an evolutionary biologist and a great speaker on my podcast a few days ago. And he's just like, so 100% cells are conscious. Because they have a model of the world. They have a model of themselves. They're making predictions about the world to persist against thermodynamics. They're doing all of these things that, you know, we sort of use to describe humans as conscious or animals as conscious.
Yeah.
It could just be a minuscule amount. I would agree that sort of what seems to be happening on a human integration of consciousness is that we have like trillions of features. We're somehow integrating our entire past history into our current moment, into all of our perception, all of our senses. It's a sublimely complicated integration that makes our conscious experience like just unfathomably crazy and brilliant and wonderful. But it seems like a cell, for me at least, is doing that. It's just on such a smaller scale that we kind of are hesitant to use that word, but it seems that the essence is there.
Basically, what I hear you say is that we are mistaking a quantitative difference for a qualitative difference.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So we of course, human consciousness is vastly more complex than whatever we mean by consciousness of a cell. It's not like a cell thinks internally the same thoughts that a human thinks. No, nobody's saying that. Just as nobody's saying that a memory of a kidney cell is not the same as what you experience when you close your eyes and think back in time. But what I'm saying about memory, what I think you are saying about consciousness, is that there is no hidden force. There is no secret that we haven't discovered yet. It's just how you arrange those things and the combinations and the patterns that arise as a result of that arrangement that makes consciousness, that makes human memory.
Right. 100%. Would you fall towards that or away? Like, what's your hesitation there? Why do you think
I 100% agree with that. I would not add anything to it. I very much believe that when people talk about discovering consciousness, the origins of consciousness, or the explaining consciousness, I think what they're imagining is that at some point scientists from some lab will come out and say, we've got it. There's this hidden dimension of reality or some special new physical force that we hadn't a name for. And that's what consciousness is. And that's what it's been all along. And everybody will go, okay, so that's what it was. Okay, now we got it. That will never happen. What needs to happen is a total restructuring of how we think about ourselves. That's what understanding consciousness will be. It's not discovering some new physical force, it's reframing how you think about the process in the first place.
Yes. I really love that. I think that's awesome. How do you think we start to do that? Because we have all of this research, all of these institutions set up to do science in the way that we're doing it. So how do we just put it all in the bin and start again? Like, how do we even start to do that? How do we create new frameworks, new paradigms, new ways of thinking about this that makes more sense with the knowledge that we have in 2025? Like, how do you even take the first step in doing that?
I think that what prevents us from doing that is only paying attention to our present moment in time and ignoring the fact that our minds, our brains, every aspect of our body and biology and physiology has a 3-4 billion-year-old history. And it is a sequence of predictable events of not some of them are predictable, some are predictable. What I mean is of events that make sense, of logical, of rational events that have led us to this point. And if you trace it from the very beginning, then you can understand it from first principles. If you only take humans into account, of course, all you know is your own mind. To build it up from the bottom, you have to start from the beginning. You have to start with, where does life come from? Where does a cell come from? Where does a multicellular body? What is the logic of that? Why do we have that multicellular body? What is a brain? What does it do? What is its biological function? And when you do it step by step like that, then you will arrive at your own mind without encountering any point where suddenly some magic explosion happens and something totally new is created. You will see this unbroken line that connects you to this very flow of nature in the world. And I think that's the solution. We have to take into account everything that science has learned about our past. And that's vastly more than we have known 20, 30 years ago. We can now, for the first time in human history, trace our story from the very beginning of origin of life without any gaps, without any billions of years when we say, well, we don't know what happened there, but then eventually this emerges. No, we can trace every single meaningful step. And I think once you do that, that gives a totally different framing for all those psychological terms that we've talked about. You see them as something that grows out of those small things rather than that something that just exists in your mind and you have to find some location within a molecule for it.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. I really do. I think I've clarified my own understanding of consciousness through an evolutionary lens better than anything else. Really thinking about what those primitive systems were doing 800 million years ago, however far you go back, and really trying to think about them and what they're doing and how it would have emerged from those early biological systems. You've clearly thought a lot about that story. I think it's the greatest story ever told. How far do we have to wind back the clocks for you to get to something where we think this consciousness is either starting to emerge or it is emerging? Kind of paint that picture. What is that system? How far back are we? Where are we? As much detail as possible. I'm so interested in that.
You know, it really depends on what you are satisfied with, how much explanation is satisfying for you. I think for a physicist, you would need to go back all the way to the Big Bang. I'm a biologist, so for me, origin of life is sufficient. I say 4 billion years is good enough. What happens before that, that's beyond my area of expertise. But so for me, what we really have to start with is the distinction between information and matter. That is something that's built into life from the very beginning. We think of DNA, RNA as molecules, but they're primarily, the most important part of them is that they're pieces of information. And it's those pieces of information that are actually alive. There is no atoms that are the same between my DNA and my grandfather's DNA. They're made of totally different atoms coming from different sources. What is inherited, what is preserved, what exists, what continues existing is information. And I think if you start with that premise, well, then eventually by folding that information like an origami sheet, by making it more complicated, by embedding it into different parts of your body, by sort of wrapping it in the circuits of the brain, you eventually see how that information gradually matures into your consciousness. And then you don't have that puzzle for where in my body is this consciousness? Is it here? Is it here? Is it there? Well, it's not in your body because you are not your body. You are this piece of information that inhabits your body. Once you see it that way, I think it's a lot easier to connect yourself to the material world and not see a contradiction between being special, being wonderful, being magical, being miraculous, and consisting of atoms and molecules, because atoms and molecules were never just atoms and molecules. They were always essences, ideas, superpowers, properties, and out of those things that's what builds up everything else.
Really cool. Information is one of those concepts that I've talked to guests about for like an hour, and then I understand far less after the hour. Like I'm a million times more confused. My brain hurts. How do you think about information and matter being the most primitive substances in the world? How should the listener think about this? Because this is weird. Information as a word is weird. It's hard to understand. Is there a good model that people can have for it?
I think it's very simple. Matter is the stuff of the universe. Information is how the stuff is arranged.
That's fine with me. But then physicists tell me that information's more primitive. And that doesn't make any sense to me. How can something that is an arrangement of matter be more primitive than the matter it's
Well, I won't step on
the
the toes of the physicist because I'm not a physicist, but I can see how information could be more fundamental than, for example, DNA or RNA. There's a debate about what started life on Earth. We now think that it's probably RNA, that was the original form of life, if you want to call it that. And only then did we acquire DNA as a separate medium as a different, more superior, more stable medium for genes. But the genes stayed the same. The genes are still that same unbroken line that goes all the way to the origin of life. It never broke. It never stopped. Whatever our idea of origin of life is, each one of us is connected to that in a straight line. There's no other way. And so the medium has changed. The physical nature of it has changed. The matter has changed, but the information has stayed the same. So in that sense, I would say in biology, you could argue that information is primary and matter is secondary. Maybe physicists mean something similar to that, but I'll be out of my depth if I try to go beyond the origin of life.
Yeah, very far beyond my own depth as well. It just, when someone tells me that information describes the state of matter, but that it's more fundamental, maybe I'm not supposed to be thinking about it in the way that I am. That just sounds like a paradox immediately.
I mean, so, and I might be totally wrong here. I'm really an amateur in any of that, but from what I understand, what makes us think that matter is something solid? What about it is different? It has mass, right? It weighs something, drags you down, and what is mass? Mass is this property that a particle has in the Higgs field. And what is a particle? Well, a particle is some configuration of energy wrapped in space-time. And what is space-time? Oh, well, I don't know. If you start breaking it down to those things, it all kinds of sounds like a big mathematical equation that's solving itself. And every property that we hold on to, really, if you zoom in, it's still a mathematical equation. And so maybe that's what is meant by information as primary, and matter is a derivation of that information. But, again, Higgs field is where I don't dive, just because it's, I have a lot of things to to dive into already.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well explained though. It's just it's head scratching complicated stuff.
Oh yes, all of it is, for sure. That's what we'll have to do, to head scratch.
Yes, exactly. That's what podcasts are for. If we did rethink about consciousness from a bottom-up perspective. We try and take the human out of it and all of our phenomenal subjectivity and all of our sort of preconceptions or intuitions about what consciousness should be, and we really try go from this bottom-up perspective, as you say, and I think makes a lot of sense. What do you think? How do you think the research changes? How do the experimental paradigms change? How do the ways that we really, what should we be trying to accomplish under that new reframing, in your view?
Well, I think we would probably gradually shift from trying to break down our own consciousness to trying to build it up artificially. Um, it's a big discussion of what would count as artificial consciousness. How would we know if we achieved that artificial consciousness? Would it just be artificial consciousness by definition if we decided to build it up from first principles? But I think that's where it will probably go. And I think now we're just so spooked by this idea that AI could be conscious that we're not even seriously considering that as a, as a viable direction or even possibility. But I think what blinds us to that is what the no true Scotsman fallacy, the idea that someone says, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. And someone else says, well, my Uncle Angus is a Scotsman and he puts sugar on his porridge. And the first person says, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. So it's a logical fallacy where you rescue a failed generalization, basically. And I think we do that with consciousness all the time. Where it used to be the Turing test. We used to think that, well, if something can convince you that it's conscious. Now it seems like a joke.
Yeah.
Nobody believes that anymore.
True.
But so now we move the goalpost and we have all kinds of complicated tests and benchmarks that we've set now to say, well, unless it does that, it's definitely not conscious. But then when it does that, well, we also move the goalpost and we'll keep doing that because we simply can't accept the idea that something could be like us, and whatever it will be, it's not truly like us. It's not the true Scotsman. I think we'll have to contend with that, and at some point just decide as a society what counts as consciousness and what's not. It's harder for me to say how it will reflect on research. What worries me more is how it will reflect on our everyday life. We will have robots in our life.
Yes.
No matter what we think about that, it will happen very soon. And then at some point, those robots would probably start telling us that they're sad and they don't want to work.
Yeah.
And so what will it take for us to believe them?
I had Thomas Metzinger on the podcast, who sort of famously tried to sign a moratorium on all AI development because he's very scared that we're going to create artificial suffering. That's sort of either an algorithm will just create some fundamental change in AI, and then it will just be suffering. It will be in pain, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Either in a physical body or in a computer, again, whatever that means. And that's just like, what the hell does that even mean?
Yeah.
Is that something that you worry about, that you think about, that makes any sense to you whatsoever?
I think about that a lot, and I wish that I could come to a clear conclusion, but unfortunately, where I am is just kind of being suspended in that question. What would it mean for AI to feel pain? It's the same exact question that I have when working with sea slugs. Students ask me, I show them that sea slug, and they go, well, does it feel pain? Well, what does that mean for a sea slug? You put into that word a very human feeling that includes a very specific subjective sensation that we humans have that incorporates lots of abstractions of our body state, of our sensory experience, of our memories, of our predictions of the future, of our fear. No, the sea slug doesn't have that.
Yes.
But it has something. It responds to the stimuli, but that's something. Well, bacteria also have that. So where do you draw the line? Well, you can't. It's just that word only refers to humans. And if you want to make a comparison, you have to come up with some other definition of that word that is not based on yourself. So it's the same with AI, I think. we have to define it before we decide whether AI is suffering or not. It really depends on what we put into that word, and I don't know how to resolve this. It's something that worries me. Something that I think you have to be at least imagining. If you, I don't know if we're under a threat of artificial general intelligence. If that's something that we should think is an existential threat, but I think it's something that we should be thinking about. If you're at least not trying to picture it, I think you just don't have enough imagination.
Yeah. Pulling the wool over your eyes is not going to work for the next decade in how things evolve.
Exactly.
Yeah. Why do you think we haven't just defined consciousness? Why can't we just do it by democratic process? We just come up with a load of definitions and we vote on them. We decide who are the most important people to vote on it, and we vote on a definition, and then that's just the definition.
No,
wouldn't that
I think
help
everybody would have a different definition, and I don't think that many people would agree with this bottom-up approach that we just came up with, because I think it's in human nature to hold on to a line that separates myself and the rest of the universe, the rest of the world, the rest of nature, even my own body. It's the same line that we talked about when we were talking about my research, how it's difficult for people to process this idea that body memory and my memory is the same thing. It's hard to wrap your mind around. You want for there to be a line that puts you into some, not just your body, it's me and my body. I am not my body. I'm not my brain. Me and my brain. Me and the rest of the world. But all of these lines, they sort of tend to dissolve if you stare at them closely enough. If you look at them in the microscope, you realize that there is no line. And I think we've always been doing that. It's the same thing that people used to do in the past when they thought of humans as this divinely ordained species that's distinct from every other species. We are magical. We are created by God, and we're presiding over nature. It's the same line. It's the same thing that says, well, my experience, my existence is so magical. It's so special. There's something so unique about it that it could not possibly be all those other things that I can just look at. I think it's the same idea. It's just human nature to draw those lines. But I think that letting go of the lines actually is the way forward.
Right.
It is something that will actually make you happier, will make you feel like you are part of the world. It will give you a foundation for meaning, for purpose, for what to do in your life, for how to structure your ethics, your morality, and how to be happier as a person. So I think letting go of the distinctions, however difficult it is, it will not diminish what you are, who you are, but it will elevate it.
I couldn't agree more. It's an even more incredible biological story. Like, to think that we're all super organisms of trillions of cells with their own goals coordinating is like the most mind-bogglingly insane. It's like, why are we not talking about this all the time? Why do we even have that's the most incredible thing ever. I don't because I think it just blows open the constraints on what could be possible in like regenerative medicine. The possibility space just expands so much more when you're like, oh my God, like what could be possible under that framework? To give biology the credence of how incredible it is, I think just expands the possibilities of research avenues, of even commercial opportunities, just anything. But it's so much more expansive to me than the limited old definition that we do seem to cling to.
Yeah. And I hope that this spirit will be incorporated in just average science classes. That we'll stop thinking of science as a list of facts, which I think is what turns so many people away from science, that we're so trained to science giving us no meaning. It's almost a faux pas. You're not supposed to ask for meaning. Science just gives you facts. It doesn't give you meaning. But it can. And I think that if you put everything in perspective, if you consider everything to be this long, never-ending story that you are part of, I think it really unifies science and self-fulfillment, what we need practically, what science can give us on a practical level, and also what it can give us spiritually for self-satisfaction, for living fulfilled lives and enjoying being on this planet.
Yes. I love that. I couldn't agree more. With all of your knowledge of biological systems, all the research that you've done, if a headline came out, paper comes out, conscious AI, we have it, here it is. What would that paper need to have in it for you to believe it? For you to say, oh, that's true. Like, I believe that. What would that what would that paper be?
This is a great question that cuts to the heart of the matter. You know, it reminds me of a question that people used to ask me when we debated on, you know, theological matters, and they would ask me, what would it take for you to believe in Jesus? What sort of miracle would it, and I, if Jesus appeared in front of you and turned water into wine, would you just immediately believe everything, or would you still find some way to say, oh no, but maybe it's this and that, maybe it's not quite that? And I wonder if I will have the courage to believe a paper like that. And it's difficult to say what it would take. I hope that it will happen, because I want to challenge that myself, but it's hard to imagine.
Here's maybe a different way of thinking about it. Google DeepMind have been trying to model a cell for a while, right? They've been trying to use AI to model a cell. If we've somewhat agreed earlier that a cell is conscious, if DeepMind are able to just continuously prove that this cell model they have is accurate, say all of the data that comes out of it experimentally is the same as other normal cells, is that then digital consciousness?
Well, it's a digital model, but not every model necessarily means, not every predictable model necessarily means consciousness. Again, I think that this definition would have to come from some first principles. It would have to be something that I deeply believe is consciousness and can immediately identify in a gene regulatory network, for example. And I just don't think that will happen. I think that what might happen is we will agree on some definition, and then we'll say, yeah, well, under that definition, it definitely has a process that would fall under that. And that will be as far as we can go in saying that the cell is conscious. I think that that's probably what it will be. But it's a much more difficult question about AI and consciousness, because here we're really talking about the possibility of achieving something that's like our consciousness, not just something that's, you know, a microscopic version of the same thing, but something that would actually be comparable to it. And how would we know if it's comparable? You know, I think that we'll probably just eventually stop thinking about that. Eventually, we'll just stop asking that question when AI becomes so integrated into our life, and we'll take it for granted that these machines have the same experiences and the same behavior as us. I think we'll just stop questioning the fact that they can have consciousness, and it will seem like something that humans asked about 100 years ago. Like at some point, people asked if maybe life was fundamentally different from non-life, if there was some special force in living organisms. That was the concept of vitalism. Well, that's just obsolete now. Nobody thinks that. It's not that somebody disproved it. People just stopped suggesting that.
Right. That's a weird world, isn't it? Where we have these humanoid robots that we all just accept are capable of some form of emotions. They're so complex, and maybe it's just mimicry the whole way down, but the mimicry is so strong that it's convinced all of us, and that just becomes the acceptable definition.
I think the past 5 years just blunted our capacity for awe.
Yes, good point.
The fact that we have these machines that talk to us about anything, and we pick apart some blunders that they make. I mean, it's just funny to me. Imagine showing Plato or Aristotle ChatGPT. What would they think? I don't think they would argue for a second. Oh, is this machine truly conscious? I think they'll be like, yeah, you got it. That's it. That's it.
Yeah, yes.
So yeah, it is a weird world. It is a weird world to live right now, and there's no indication that it's about to stop getting weirder.
Do you think that DeepMind will be able to model a cell? Like, you can maybe appreciate just how wildly complex a cell is more than most as a molecular biologist. It's staggeringly complex.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
I don't
think?
think so. I don't. Not right
No.
now. Not right now, because I think to model something, you need to know the wet things. To model it in silica, you have to know what's happening. With pipettes and chemicals. And we keep discovering new things all the time that we didn't know were there. Like every time we go into the lab and test something, there's some new effect that pops up that we didn't expect based on any cell biology. So I think that we know so little about what actually physically is happening inside the cell. We keep discovering new post-translational modifications. That's how things get turned on and off in the cell. That's what regulates everything. It used to be just like phosphorylation. That's what turns everything on. Now there's like 100 different possible things, and each one is a new dimension of signaling in a cell, and we keep discovering new ones. So I think just the raw data accumulation about cell biology is nowhere near completion. I'm sure that there could be some large scale patterns that could be modeled productively, and they could probably predict many things about cells, but nowhere near explain the entire variability of cellular responses in cell biology.
Interesting. I think to fulfill the purpose of what they're trying to achieve as well, you almost do need the whole cell, right? Because if you're doing drug trials on a digital cell, but you don't have 20% of it that you don't think is important to the system, you're not really going to be able to fast track that drug through any trial. If that system, I don't know how you could ever 100% validate that your model system is fully modeling the system, but you can't have just elements of the system. Like it all works together. It is very holistic.
Exactly. And there are things that we don't even know what they do at all in biology. In cell biology, there's these what are they called? Obelisks. These, I don't know if you've heard about these recently discovered structures. Apparently they exist everywhere. It's the cell biological structure. Like everybody has them. They're ancient, they're preserved, and nobody has any inkling of what they do. Just
really?
no idea. No clue. And so how many of other things are like that? How many things that we just don't even know exist inside of the cell? I go to a conference, and every time somebody tells me about some new dimension of cell biology, then I'm like, oh, that is also a thing. Okay, well now we have to add that to the model. So I think that the cell is a whole world, and we are just starting to tap into it.
So we don't know anything about these obelisks. Where did we find them? How did this experiment? Like what? I haven't heard of this at all. I've no idea.
Yeah, so I've it's out of my depth. That I've just read about it. I think in New York Times there was an article about historical research into these structures. They've been known for decades, and apparently very widespread. And something is known about their molecular composition. I can't exactly remember what that is. But the bottom line is that nothing that we can detect or identify happens if you remove them. They can be deleted from cells, but then nothing happens. Well, nothing happens just means we haven't looked in the right place.
Yeah.
If they're preserved in evolution, there's got to be some reason why they exist, and maybe they're not doing something in this cell that we've tested. Maybe they're doing something somewhere else. But as far as I know, people have been speculating for decades and still haven't come up with a satisfactory answer.
Right. It's what makes science so interesting, though. It makes it such an adventure, is that we truly have no idea, right? Is it 98% of the genome doesn't code for proteins, and we don't really know what they're doing? It's like a massive amount of our genome. We say genes code for proteins that build us.
Oh no, no, we're
way
past that. We're way past that.
Yeah,
I've heard it was an XKCD comic, I think, how that view evolves, how we're making proteins and RNA just as a template for proteins, but now everybody's so focused on RNA that like this, it's got multiple frames, and I think the last one is that life is RNA, and then proteins are just running errands for that RNA. That's what it all really is about.
But it's still the model that you hear about in college. It's still the one that I learned. And I don't think when I was even learning it, I was even told, look, this isn't really how it works, but we're just kind of giving you this diagram because that's really the best explanation we have. And like, I don't know why a lot more often throughout college, they couldn't just tell me, look, we don't really have any clue. Even when you hear the word like signal cascade, right? Like that kind of means there's a bunch of stuff that happening there that we don't really know. And I don't think that was ever explained. The depth of our ignorance wasn't really, pointed out to us. I think maybe lecturers sometimes want to show that they kind of have more answers than they do, maybe, but
yeah, just from teaching undergrads myself, I can say that that's true, because if you really start telling people the uncertainty, then your whole class will be uncertainty, because everything is it could all fall apart in a moment, and we'll have to reconsider everything. But especially if you're talking to people who don't have a lot of background in biology, you have to give them a complete story. You have to start with something that makes sense, and then I think you can introduce nuance. I mean, I agree. Yes, RNA we now recognize to be hugely important. Primary proteins are kind of secondary. But if you're teaching it for the first time, if students don't know about the DNA, RNA, proteins, it is a reasonable first approximation to say that everything is done by proteins. Proteins are the machines, and RNA just carries the message to the protein. Once you understand that, you can say, well, actually, you know what? Actually, RNA is also important. Actually, RNA might be even more important. I think it's an easier way to describe it, just because proteins are marvelous machines, and I think it is one of the most interesting aspects of a introductory biology class, to kind of get into what makes proteins so great. They're so versatile. I mean, what an incredible substance that you can make any machine out of, for any possible function in nature, out of these 20 building blocks. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. I think it's what's interesting to me now that we have this capacity with AI to invent new proteins, invent new functions. And what are we inventing? It's very hard to invent a function that nature hasn't already invented. Like, okay, maybe digesting plastic, maybe. But it's hard because nature has already created so many different proteins that what do you even do with it?
That's a good area to go to, this synthetic biology. This is what the Nobel Prize was obviously awarded for. How do you think about synthetic biology in the next? You seemed a little bit skeptical there. Say 5-10 years down the line, like what do you think the fullest extent of synthetic biology could look like? Where are there any areas that maybe people haven't talked about a lot that you think could have potential? Just talk about that a bit.
Look, synthetic biology is this whole building up from the ground up that we've been talking about. That's what it is. It's creating things from basic components, from first principles. So I think you could call this sort of philosophical approach to neuroscience, you could call that synthetic biology. And I'm not by any means skeptical about synthetic biology in general. No, don't get me wrong. I think it's a fantastic approach to biology, and lots of interesting things are being built out of components, molecular circuits, sort of artificially self-sustaining systems. I just think that a cell is a huge task for synthetic biology, and it will take us 100 years to get to that, not 5 or 10 years. But of course it will move forward, and the complexity of the things that we can create will increase. The tools that allow us to track organisms in time, events that happen in time will improve. There's viruses that are now being created artificially. Well, again, artificially, what does it mean artificially? Artificially means their genome was synthesized based on an actual really existing genome with lots of modifications. It's not exactly the same thing as creating a virus from scratch. But that, I think, could be possible. I think that maybe, okay, that could be actually a realistic thing that I could say. Maybe 5-10 years, I can imagine a fully artificial virus.
Do we want that?
Do we want that? Probably not.
I'm not clear on if we want that. I'm not clear if that's something we should aim for.
Yeah. Unfortunately, nuclear bombs happen before nuclear power plants, and so we might be in a scenario where a bioweapon is the first thing that's synthetically created. Yeah.
Yeah, God, that's such a
Well,
sad in terms of
let's not call it a
progress.
virus. Let's call it a gene delivery vehicle.
That sounds so
Maybe
much nicer.
we can create gene delivery vehicles that would be tailored to individual humans, that wouldn't cause an inflammatory response, that wouldn't
Right,
be as dangerous as viruses, and maybe that would be the next step for gene therapy.
right.
So something like that I can imagine.
Yeah, the examples you hear about are like things that will go around your artery, little nanoparticles that will clean up like arterial plaques and these sort of things. Like,
Yeah.
but I do
Yeah.
wonder, do you know of any research areas that are particularly interesting at the moment in in the synthetic biology field where they're trying to create proteins to tackle a particular problem?
That's a little bit out of my area of expertise, so I can't say much about that. What I do know is what is exciting for me, because I study memory, is these new possibilities of recording cellular experience. There's these new technologies for um, recording the events that happen to the cell into its own DNA. And then you read off that DNA and you can kind of get a transcript of what's been happening to that cell. And there's these synthetic systems that
Oh,
are
wow.
engineered to contain that module. Yeah, so that's absolutely crazy. And of course, it will be super useful for our research into memory, because we can really track cell fates for a long time and see what sort of patterns lead to what sort of memories. So yeah, maybe in the future, something like that would really elevate our research. Maybe we'll go, we moved from sea slugs, a very simple form of memory, to an even simpler form of memory in those growing petri dish growing kidney cells. Maybe we will go even one step further and, into synthetic systems, into cell-free systems, and study memory in those engineered systems in a few years from now. I can see that.
Cool. Is there a treasure trove in your field that, say, the next 10 experiments that you do just go remarkably well and you're like, wow, that's insane. Like, where do you think your research in your field could go where
Mhm.
you get some results and you're like, holy crap,
Mhm.
that's huge. That's going to change the world. Is there
Yeah.
any sort of steps that you think?
Well, I can give you a teaser of our next paper
Please.
that we are working on right now that I think is very exciting. But what we're looking into now, so we've already shown that uh, any cell of the body, kidney cells, form memories in the same way as brain cells do. But what we're now studying is whether those memories that they form can spread from cell to cell. And what we're finding is, yes, in fact, they can. And there's not just, it looks like there might be multiple ways that these memories can spread. So maybe different ones spread through different routes. I won't tell you anymore. It's early days, but I think this could potentially be really impactful, because it would change further how we think about body memory and what does it mean for part of the body to remember something. This would make a difference, for example, for transplantation, for organ transplants.
Mm,
If your organ carries some cellular memory that can spread to other cells, well, then that would probably also spread from organ transplants. That kind of thing you hear about, and it used to be considered very, voodoo, spooky, that a person gets an organ transplant and their personality changes. But we're coming to the point when it's not really that voodoo at all, and then that might actually be very simple mechanisms that could explain that. So
wild.
that's where we're headed next. But
That's
also, we
wild.
would like to use our model to inform um, questions of neuroscience. For example, drug discovery in mental health diseases and neurodegenerative diseases. We want to know if the cellular memory that we're studying in our kidney cells is also affected by the same issues, the same problems as brain memory. We have certain problematic proteins, like the amyloid beta in Alzheimer's disease, or alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's disease, that when something happens with them, with those proteins, when something goes wrong with them, they start forming these aggregates in neurons, and that causes mental decline, dementia. Maybe it also affects cellular memory. And if it does, then that means that we have a very, very effective system to study potential treatments. It's
Right.
very difficult to study a brain. It's extremely difficult to even study neurons. Even neurons in a petri dish is an extremely finicky, expensive system that takes weeks to develop. You once you do, you don't breathe over it just in case something happens to it. And maybe you have 3 or 6 dishes of that to try different conditions. Maybe you'll get 1 million of those neurons out of a mouse brain, but we get hundreds of thousands of cells per week. We don't care about quantity. We have unlimited throughput with these dividing cells. So if we can study big questions that are relevant to human disease in that sort of simplified system and make predictions about what will work and what will not work, that would be a treasure trove. That would really expand the possibilities of neuroscience.
Very cool. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that translational aspect because the brain is so impenetrably difficult to study.
Of
Something I
course,
wanted to ask you earlier that comes to mind. Do you think the gut instinct is a thing with your research? Like, it's kind of a bit known to be a little bit pseudoscience that there isn't really some sort of instinctual memory in the gut, but you're kind of making me double think this in that it's possible it is. Like, how do you think about something like a gut instinct with your research?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it all comes down to definitions. Usually when we refer to gut instinct, we just refer to decision making prior to conscious awareness. And
Yes.
there are studies that show that, yeah, in many cases, people just by brain scanning, you can tell that people settle on a decision before they come up with reasons for it. First, you decide, and then you start thinking about why you decided that. So I think that's what we usually say when we mean gut instinct. But there's also literal connection between the gut and the brain. And we know very well by now that it's a real connection that really impacts not just your hunger, things that you would associate with the gut, but things like anxiety, things that you don't think are connected to the gut on any level. So that is real. That is it's not a speculation. It's well established that events, the health of the gut, has an impact on the well-being of the brain, and vice versa. We know that brain can have an effect on digestion, on the gut itself. So it's a two-way street for sure. No two ways about it. Now, how much does this what is happening in the gut affect our decision making? I don't know exactly, but I think it's a very reasonable hypothesis to make,
Interesting.
and maybe somebody would study exactly. For example, how does your diet, how does the state of the composition of bacteria in your gut? We know that's super important now. How does that composition affect your economic decisions? Maybe that research already exists. I just don't know about it.
Yeah, stuff's really wild. But you think it wouldn't be a crazy far-fetched idea for
Not at all.
even core parts of our personality, something that we hold to be very core to us, that information would be distributed in neurons, not just in the brain, but possibly all over the body.
I think the key question is, what do you mean by core? Core in the sense of it's very deep, or core in the sense of it encompasses so many different dimensions? Um, your kidney's not going to store the memory of your 4th birthday. It's not going to remember how to play piano.
Yes.
That you need to store in the configuration of neurons. But what could happen is that an organ transplant makes a person more aggressive. Maybe it changes some hormone release. Maybe what changes is that some gland in the body starts producing more testosterone as a result of something that arrived with an organ transplant. And that would change the personality. I mean, in a sense, that would change the core of your personality. But it's a very simple change. It's something that you could enact with just one molecule. So that, I think, is possible, but it's more difficult to imagine some very fine-tuned change in in how you conceptualize yourself, for example. Like those linguistic things, I think, are less likely to be affected by body memory.
Yes. So a key point that I'm getting here is that cells in the body will only store memories that really support its own goals. But then
Yeah,
I guess there's a bit of a blurry area in how we fully understand how an individual cell's goals become the whole body's goals, right? Like a kidney cell is intimately important. The information related to a kidney is very important to the cell of a kidney, but
correct.
we don't fully understand how that individual kidney cell impacts the state of the entire kidney.
Right. Yeah.
And then
Or
how
the
that
state of the entire body either.
right.
Yeah. That's a much more sort of high level systems analysis that we would have to do. You can't just be looking at a cell culture. You would have to study interactions between cells at the level of the entire organism. Yeah, I think that's the sort of the next, not even the next step in our research, but would be the next, you know, phase, next era of this kind of research would be to then move in vivo and look at it on a more of a systems level.
Stuff is so cool. The implications really are, it could be massive. Another conversation that I've had recently is how people tend to hold trauma in their body in a real sense. And you hear
Yeah.
these cases of people who, you know, when they're in MDMA therapy or ketamine therapy, make real big breakthroughs emotionally, but it actually somehow also sort of seems to cure some pain that they've had for a long time. Again,
Right.
seems a bit woo-woo, but I think it's kind of becoming more the fact that it's not really, that we do tend to hold baggage, emotional trauma, emotional baggage in parts of the body. And I really wonder what implications your work could have on
Yeah.
that, if we could really understand the extent to which we hold that trauma in our body.
Yeah, this is something that I gradually changed my mind on since our study came out last year, because it's not how I thought about this when we were working on this. And it really surprised me that everybody latched on to the body keeps the score
Yes.
immediately. That was the first interpretation: body memory, kidneys store memory. Oh, kidneys must be storing my trauma. To me, it was, well, no, that's like you said, it's woo. It's trauma is the brain thing. Trauma is your emotional processing, is your analysis of events that have happened to you, and kidneys store kidney things. But then, as I was thinking about that more, I sort of softened on this idea. And, just as we were saying a second ago, we know that the brain affects the body. Something like a stress hormone definitely is received by organs of the body, and it definitely can affect how that organ works. We know that the body affects the brain. We know that hormones secreted from different organs, depending on how they work, depending on what they do, can affect functioning. I mean, even hunger, even just like the level of glucose in your body affects whether you're grumpy or not. So that's not a surprise. So we also now know that cells in the body can store patterns of experience and form memories and change themselves in response. So you put 1, 2, and 3 together, well, the
Yeah.
body does keep the score. Then we just don't know exactly what score is it keeping of what yet. We can't make that specific of a claim, but it no longer seems like such a crazy proposition as it did in the past. And so maybe the body really does store some element, at least, of the trauma, maybe that contributes to the emotional component. But we have to be careful with that, because again, we're relying here on our own intuitions. And when you are saying that, well, I've cleared my trauma and also my body feels better, well, it doesn't mean that the body was storing the trauma. Your,
Yeah.
your, your sensation of your body happens in your brain. So it could also be that the sensations have changed. But that's not to say that that's impossible. So I've
Yes.
really opened my mind on that and no longer think of it as something that's pseudoscientific or woo-woo.
Right. That's a really interesting one. It's very interesting when someone goes through some amount of research and then changes their tone on something because of that finding. Would you say
Yeah.
there's any other big biological shifts that you've gone through, maybe not even just on your recent research, but throughout your time learning about biology, learning about consciousness, anything where you've really changed your tone or
Changed my
shifted on an
mind.
idea?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've changed my mind on what dopamine does.
Yes.
I I I think I misunderstood it for a long time.
That's a whole other
Uh,
podcast. I would love to ask
yeah,
you about dopamine, but that's like another, that's like two
that is
hours just
another
on
that
dopamine.
is another that is a 2-hour discussion. What about something that's related to what we've talked about? What have I changed my mind on? Well, I guess I used to think that language is this explosion in the dark in our history. That language is what transformed us from just another species to a human, to some categorically new type of creature. But I've changed my mind on that. I think that language is still the thing that makes us human. But I don't think it was this explosion. I think it happened gradually, and it built upon things that existed before that for probably millions of years. And that the trajectory towards us as humans starts much, much earlier. So basically what I thought was this trajectory towards our modern self starts with the invention of language. Now I think that this trajectory starts billions of years earlier, and language is just the latest expression of that. And that really, if you were around to study life 2 billion years ago, you wouldn't be able to draw a human that the way that they would look in 2 billion years. But you would be able to predict that something like a human would happen.
Interesting.
So I think that is something that I changed my mind on.
That would be another 2-hour podcast to really dive into that. You're too interesting a person.
Oh, thank you.
Is it possible, and no is an acceptable answer to this, is it possible for you to frame your change on dopamine in 60 seconds from what you thought it was to what you think it is now without going into the myriad nuances that definitely exist in that?
Okay, let me try to simplify. Well, what I thought dopamine is a pleasure molecule. You know, your standard story is you do something, you get dopamine, it feels good, and then you want to do it more. But dopamine doesn't actually give you pleasure. If you ask a person who takes Adderall for ADHD, it's not like it creates euphoria. But it does something else. If you give a pigeon a button and make it pick that button 50 times to get a reward, it will pick the button 50 times, it will get the reward, and then it will stop. It gets tired. It will wait a while. If you make it pick the button 100 times, it will wait a longer time. It'll get even more tired. But if you make the reward opening unpredictable, if you make that number of picks random, then the pigeons don't stop. Then they just keep going and going and going forever. And that's what dopamine does. Dopamine doesn't signal pleasure. It signals, why did I get this reward unpredictably? Go and figure out why isn't it always here. And until you figure out how I can always get that reward, don't be satisfied. So it doesn't actually make us happier. It makes us work. It makes us work to get that reward anytime, not just a surprising time, but anytime. And then at the time when it becomes boring, when we know exactly where to get it, that's when it stops.
Well explained. Nicely done. I think, again, dopamine is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts, mostly because it's seeped into popular culture through like dopamine detoxes and dopamine frying people's brain with TikTok and all these things. And that requires a whole length of conversation that we'll definitely get to. But I think that was well explained as prediction error rather than a reward signal. That makes or prediction error rather than a pleasure signal.
But also, and it's an interesting example because that's one of the first times when we're creating this bottom-up language already. And maybe it's not perfect. It's not exactly there as we are changing this definition right now. But it is an example when we're talking about psychological terms in terms of molecules. And I think in the future we'll have more and more and more of that.
Yes. Really well said. Nikolay, this has been so much fun. I think you're an incredible communicator. Everyone should check out your book, One Hand Clapping. I'll admit that I'm not 100% through it yet, but it's really, really good. It's full story. It's amazing. Awesome. Unraveling the mystery of the human mind.
The human mind.
Looks beautiful in hard copy. I only have the digital, but really, really great to speak to you, man. I think you're a great communicator, an awesome scientist. Your work is really cool. I'm excited for round 2 where we talk about all the things that we didn't get to, but I really appreciate your time. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Evan. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
If you made it this far, then you must at least partially be interested in brain science, and who can blame you? It is the most interesting topic in the world. Twice per week, I talk to the most amazing neuroscientists in the entire world, so if you're interested, then subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below who you'd like me to speak to next, and thank you so much for your ongoing support.